insisting it must have been a misunderstanding, a safety check, a routine inspection. But the inspector shut her down gently but firmly, reminding her that HOA authority did not extend to private utilities, especially not at midnight, and especially not without homeowner consent. The treasurer finally spoke, his voice quiet, admitting that none of the board had authorized such actions. The secretary followed, confessing she had received the anonymous envelope with the photos and had been shocked by what she saw. Panic began to take over the president as she realized she had been exposed internally long before the inspector arrived. The inspector laid out the consequences plainly. The county would be filing a formal report. The HOA president would be held directly responsible for unauthorized utility tampering. The board would be required to cooperate fully in the investigation. The community could face fines if further violations were discovered. And the county would recommend an immediate suspension of the president's authority pending legal review. The homeowner said nothing throughout the entire process. He didn't have to. The truth did the speaking for him. The president's face drained of color. She tried to accuse the homeowner of setting her up. She tried to claim he had manipulated the panel. She tried every excuse she could reach for. But none of the board members defended her. They had seen the footage. They had seen the panic. They had seen the truth in her reaction. Without support, her authority collapsed. The board voted unanimously, on the spot, to remove her from her position temporarily until the county completed its investigation. The inspector recommended it formally. That vote stripped her of her power, her influence, and the control she had exercised over the neighborhood for years. Word spread quickly. Neighbors began stepping outside, exchanging whispers filled with relief. Some had been victims of her micromanagement for years, but had never dared speak out. Now, seeing her defeated, they realized she was not untouchable. Over the next week, the county investigation proceeded. The inspector returned for follow-up checks, and the board cooperated fully. The president remained inside her home, blinds closed, no longer patrolling, no longer issuing threats or letters. She had gone silent, buried beneath the consequences of her own actions. The homeowner's electricity remained stable, perfectly consistent, without a single flicker. His security systems ran smoothly again. For the first time since moving to Maple Ridge Lane, his home felt like his own. 3 weeks later, the county issued its final ruling. The HOA president was found responsible for multiple violations, including unauthorized access to private utilities. The board removed her permanently. Fines were issued. Regulations were rewritten. And a new policy was established requiring transparent oversight of all HOA activities. Neighbors thanked the homeowner quietly at first, then more openly as they realized how deeply the HOA's behavior had been influencing the community. He had exposed a pattern of control no one else had been able to stop. And while he didn't seek praise or attention, he knew one thing for certain. The trap he installed inside that electrical panel had done more than catch a saboteur. It had broken a cycle of abuse and restored balance to a community that had been controlled by fear for far too long. With the former president gone, the neighborhood finally breathed again. Peace returned to Maple Ridge Lane, not because of rules, or power, or authority, but because someone had decided enough was enough and refused to let the HOA cross one line too many. They thought cutting my power would force me to obey their useless HOA rules. But the moment Karen tried it one more time, the trap I installed lit up the entire street. And everyone finally saw who the real problem was. Open book full story, 3 minutes. When I bought my small fixer-upper house, I knew the HOA had issues, but I didn't expect Karen, the board president, to make my life her mission. Every week she complained about something, my grass, my paint color, even where I parked my truck. But the real war started the day she cut my power for the first time. She blamed it on a routine check. But I found the breaker switch flipped from outside. I told her to stop touching my property. She just smirked and said, "Follow HOA rules, and maybe your power will stay on. I reported her to the board. No one cared. She was the board. 2 days later, my power went out again. Same switch. Same smirk. Same excuse. That's when I realized. She only understood humiliation. So I set a trap. I installed a tiny motion-activated camera near the breaker box, perfectly legal, perfectly hidden. And because Karen loved attention, I connected it to a small portable projector I aimed at my garage door. If anyone touched the switch, the camera would instantly broadcast the footage on the giant garage door like a movie screen. The neighborhood would see everything. I didn't have to wait long. At 7 a.m., Karen marched up to my breaker with her clipboard. She looked around, then reached out and flipped the switch. Click. The projector activated. And suddenly, the whole neighborhood saw live footage of Karen cutting my power, on a 10-foot screen. Kids on bikes stopped. Neighbors stepped out. People recorded on their phones. Someone even said, "So you're the reason our power keeps going out?" Karen froze. Her face turned red. She screamed something about malfunctioning equipment, but no one believed her. By noon, the board held an emergency meeting. And by evening, Karen was removed as HOA president. Not only did they apologize to me, they also paid for all the food that spoiled in my fridge and installed a lock on my breaker box. Now every time I pass Karen, she looks away. Because she knows. I didn't fight her. I exposed her. If you want more crazy HOA revenge stories, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what the HOA did in your neighborhood. My lights kept going out every single week, and the HOA said, "Maybe your wiring is old." But I knew something was wrong. So I hid a tiny device on my porch. And what it recorded exposed the HOA president in the most humiliating way possible. My name's Daniel, and for months, I dealt with random blackouts in my house. Not the whole street, just my home. Every time the power went out, it ruined something, my fridge, my router, my work calls. I complained to the HOA, and the president, Ms. Harper, always gave the same fake smile. Maybe you should take better care of your home. Every blackout happened when I wasn't home. One night, I came home early and saw a figure walking away from the side of my house. When they noticed me, they ran. That's when I knew. Someone was doing this on purpose. So I bought a small motion-activated recorder, barely the size of a matchbox, and hid it behind the meter box. Invisible. 2 days later, the power went out again. I rushed home, grabbed the device, and plugged it into my laptop. What I saw made my jaw drop. There she was, Ms. Harper, the HOA president, cutting power to my home with a hidden switch key. She whispered on camera. "Let's see how long he lasts before selling." It all made sense. The HOA wanted to force me out so they could buy my lot cheap and turn it into a parking extension. I didn't confront her. I went bigger. At the next HOA meeting, I waited for open concerns. Then I plugged my laptop into the projector and played the clip, in front of every homeowner. Ms. Harper turned red, then pale, then tried to unplug the projector. But it was too late. The board voted on the spot. She was removed as HOA president. The HOA was forced to pay for all electrical damage, replace my wiring, and reduce my dues for a year. And Ms. Harper? Let's just say she avoids the neighborhood meetings, and the neighbors avoid her. If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA, hit the like button and subscribe my channel. When my power kept shutting off every night, I thought it was a wiring issue, until I discovered my HOA president sneaking around my breaker box. So I installed a tiny surprise that exposed everything. My lights had been going out at the same time every night, 9:47 p.m., on the dot. At first, I blamed old wiring, maybe a loose breaker. But after the third night, I realized something strange. The outage only happened when I argued with the HOA president, Linda, earlier in the day. So I walked outside the next morning to check the breaker box myself. That's when I saw fresh scratch marks around the lock, like someone had been prying it open. I knew it wasn't random. So that evening, I pretended to sleep early, but instead, I sat on my porch with all the lights off, waiting. At 9:46 p.m., I heard it. Soft footsteps. Someone trying to be quiet. Then a shadowy figure crept toward my breaker box. It was Linda. HOA Karen herself. She opened the box using a duplicate key she wasn't supposed to have. That's when I finally understood, she was cutting my power on purpose to teach me a lesson for refusing to repaint my house the color she wanted. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. Because earlier that day, I installed something inside the breaker box. A loud, motion-activated alarm, the kind that shrieks like a police siren the moment someone pulls the cover open. Linda flipped the latch. Beep peep. The alarm exploded to life, blasting through the silent neighborhood. Linda screamed so loud she almost fell backwards. Lights from neighbors' windows turned on one by one as people came outside. Everyone saw her. Everyone heard the alarm. Everyone knew she was caught messing with my power. And I walked out slowly, holding up my phone. Smile, Linda, you're on camera. Because yes, my second surprise was a small hidden camera mounted right above the box. The footage spread through the whole neighborhood group chat within minutes. The HOA board forced her to resign. She also had to pay for a lock replacement, a security upgrade, and a written apology. And my power never went out again. If you enjoyed this HOA karma story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves satisfying revenge. The land had always felt like a quiet promise, a place tucked just far enough from the edge of the neighborhood to feel like freedom, yet close enough to remind me why I'd chosen to live there. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't large. But it was mine. And when a piece of land matters that much to someone, even the slightest threat to it becomes a storm waiting to break. I first noticed the tension brewing when the Homeowners Association began sending a series of letters, thin envelopes, cold print, and vague warnings dressed as courtesy notices. They arrived one after another, each more direct than the last, making it clear the HOA had its eyes on my property. At first, the letters claimed my land fell under their jurisdiction. Then the tone shifted, suggesting my unused lot was attracting complaints. I knew what they were doing. It was the oldest HOA trick: create a problem that didn't exist, then present themselves as the solution. What they didn't realize was that I had already studied every boundary line, every zoning code, every recorded document tied to my land. I knew exactly where their power ended. And it ended far short of my property. Still, the board continued pushing. They dispatched members to inspect the edges of my lot, pacing along the boundary as if waiting for an excuse to declare themselves in charge. Their persistence revealed something deeper: this wasn't about compliance, aesthetics, or neighborhood improvement. It was about control. And more specifically, it was about acquiring a piece of land they thought had been overlooked or underused. It wasn't long before the truth bubbled up through neighborhood chatter. The HOA wanted to expand a community recreational area, and my land sat perfectly positioned for their plans. When the first bulldozer arrived at the end of the cul-de-sac, I realized they were done pretending. Notice, no vote, no attempt to negotiate with me. The board simply acted on the assumption that they could take what they wanted, and that I would panic or leave the moment they made their presence known. But I didn't panic. I had been preparing for months, ever since the first letter hinted at their intentions. What they saw as stubborn silence was actually careful observation. Every move they made, every claim they printed, every boundary they tried to alter, I documented all of it. The HOA president, a woman known for her strict posture and sharper smile, began organizing early morning gatherings near my property line. She spoke loudly, as though raising her voice would convert her wish into legal authority. She told neighbors the land was already under HOA control, that I had failed to maintain it, and that the board was forced to take action. It was a rehearsed performance, polished enough to impress anyone who didn't bother checking the facts. And that was exactly what she counted on. I kept my distance, but I watched everything. The board hired surveyors, twice. The first group left quietly after realizing the HOA's claims didn't match the county's official records. The second group was more hesitant, their equipment barely touched the soil before they packed up and left. That alone should have stopped the board. Instead, they doubled down. The president posted notices on community boards claiming eminent domain style reclamation, a term that sounded legal but meant nothing in the context of HOA authority. Meanwhile, the bulldozer sat like a threat dressed in yellow steel. I knew confrontation was coming, but I also knew something they didn't. Years earlier, when I purchased the land, I discovered a series of outdated HOA maps that included a crucial detail the board had never noticed: the original boundary lines had been redrawn decades ago due to a county land adjustment. My property never fell under the HOA, but the old map suggested it once had. I suspected the board had found those outdated maps and convinced themselves they had the right to take the land. What they didn't realize was that those same old maps contained a note, small, faded, and squeezed into the margin, confirming the original HOA boundary had been permanently corrected after a legal dispute involving the previous owner. That note was the key. And I had the complete copy. But the most important evidence wasn't the map, it was the county recording of the board's recent attempts to claim jurisdiction. Every email they sent to the county, every request for clarification, every attempt to pressure zoning officials, it was all logged. And because I had anticipated their moves, I had filed an information request early on. By the time they brought the bulldozer, I had a full archive of their improper activity. The morning the board decided to act, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Residents gathered at the edges of the street, whispering about how the HOA was finally taking action. The president strutted through them with confident steps, holding a clipboard as though it were a badge of authority. Behind her, board members stood stiffly, waiting for her command. They believed everything was already won. They believed I had no fight left. They believed wrong. When the board announced they were beginning land clearing, I finally stepped forward, not with anger, not with shouting, but with calm certainty. That moment marked the shift in power. I carried a sealed envelope, thick with documents. Inside were copies of county-recorded maps, the legal boundary corrections, and the board's own written attempts to alter jurisdiction, papers that directly contradicted every statement they had been feeding the neighborhood. The president paused, unsure of what I held. That hesitation revealed the truth. Deep down, she wasn't confident at all. She was hoping intimidation alone would get her the land before anyone asked questions. But I was ready for questions. I had been waiting for them. The crowd watched as I handed the envelope to the county officer who had arrived quietly that morning. The HOA hadn't expected him. They certainly hadn't expected him to open the documents in front of everyone. As he read, the shift in his expression was unmistakable. One by one, the board members sensed it too, their plan was collapsing, right there in public view. The officer stepped forward to speak, and though his words were calm, they carried the kind of weight no HOA could argue against. The president's face drained of color. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. The bulldozer operator shut off the engine, suddenly unsure whether he was allowed to be there at all. And that was only the beginning. The real damage to the HOA was still coming, because the documents I provided contained something even more devastating than corrected boundary lines. Something that would expose the board's deliberate attempt to mislead the entire community. Something that would soon unravel their authority from the inside. The moment the officer requested a formal investigation, I knew the balance had shifted completely. And as the neighborhood fell into stunned silence, I walked back toward my land, fully aware that the real storm was only beginning. The investigation did not begin with noise or accusations. It began with silence, the kind of silence that settles over a community when people realize the authority they trusted might have been built on nothing more than confidence and convenience. In the days that followed the confrontation at the Bulldozer, neighbors moved more cautiously, speaking in low voices, watching the HOA board with new suspicion. The board members tried to carry themselves with the same posture of control, but the dent in their confidence showed in the way they avoided eye contact and cut meetings short. The county officer's request for a formal review had set everything in motion. The HOA had been expecting an easy victory, a quick takeover of the land, and a quiet celebration afterward. Instead, they were forced to submit their records, maps, and communication history to the county office. The president, who once dismissed every question with an air of superiority, now found herself explaining every step the board had taken, every survey request, every letter they sent, every claim they made. But what she didn't know was that the most damaging evidence wasn't held by the county. It was held by me. For months I had documented their behavior. Not through confrontation, but through observation, carefully and quietly. Every time board members approached my property without permission, I recorded it. Every time they posted notices on public boards claiming they had jurisdiction, I photographed it. Every time they referenced old maps or previous bylaws to justify their actions, I captured their statements and compared them against the county's official records. I never expected to use this evidence, but the moment they brought a bulldozer to my property, I realized it was no longer a precaution. It was protection. What the board didn't realize was that their biggest mistake wasn't their attempt to seize my land. It was the fact that they left a long trail of contradictions behind them. Years earlier, the previous owner of my property had kept meticulous records. Among those records was a letter from the same HOA, dated decades before the current board had taken over. The letter acknowledged the boundary correction and explicitly stated the land was permanently excluded from HOA jurisdiction. This letter was signed by the HOA's leadership at the time, notarized, and filed with the county. The reason it mattered so much was that the current board had been claiming for months that they believed the land had always been under HOA management. That claim was impossible if they had reviewed their own archives. Either they had never looked, which showed incompetence, or they had looked and ignored the letter, which showed intent. The day of the meeting arrived quietly. The board members gathered in the community center, seated in stiff rows as the county officer spread the documents across the table. Their expressions revealed everything: nervousness, confusion, and the first signs of fear. The president tried to speak on behalf of the board, but the officer interrupted with a simple request: an explanation for the discrepancies. The board froze. The officer began with the oldest documents, the corrected maps, the adjustments filed decades earlier, and the boundary line clearly marked outside HOA control. Then he brought out the letter from the previous owner, confirming the HOA had acknowledged those boundaries long before the current dispute began. The president attempted to object, claiming the documents were outdated or irrelevant. But the officer continued. Next came the surveyor reports, the same reports that the board had dismissed publicly, insisting the surveyors were uncertain. The truth was in the records. Both surveyor groups had submitted statements confirming the land did not fall under HOA authority. The board had ignored these reports and proceeded with their plans anyway. Then came the emails. The officer presented printed copies, each revealing the board's attempts to pressure the county zoning department into redrawing boundaries, despite having no legal grounds. One email even suggested the board could proceed with land clearing, because the homeowner would likely not resist it. That single line drew a visible reaction from everyone in the room. It showed exactly what the board had intended, and how far they were willing to go. But the worst evidence came last. The officer opened a folder containing my documentation. Photos, timestamps, video clips, and logs of unauthorized visits by board members to my property. Not only had they tried to claim ownership, but they had repeatedly trespassed in the process. The room fell into complete stillness as each piece of evidence was reviewed. There was no legal argument left for them to make. The president, once so bold, now sat with tightly folded hands, her composure cracking. The board members avoided looking at one another. Their silence no longer felt like strategy. It felt like surrender. When the officer finished, he delivered his conclusion calmly but firmly. The HOA had acted outside their authority, attempted to seize land they did not own, and misled residents about their jurisdiction. Their actions warranted penalties, restitution, and a complete review of their leadership. But he wasn't finished. The investigation was being expanded to determine whether the board had misused HOA funds to hire surveyors, pay for equipment rental, and commission bulldozers, all on a project that had no legitimate basis. The community center buzzed with shock as the realization settled in. The HOA hadn't just crossed a line, they had torn it apart. Outside, neighbors gathered in uneasy clusters, waiting for news. They had seen the bulldozer, heard the rumors, and watched the conflict unfold. But they had never imagined the entire board might be implicated in something far more serious than a boundary dispute. When the meeting ended, the board members filed out with quiet steps, avoiding the eyes of the community they once controlled. I walked home with a different feeling, not victory, not relief, but clarity. The board had underestimated me. They had underestimated the law. And they had underestimated the power of truth when everything else was built on assumption. But the story wasn't over. Because the county officer had one final instruction, a full public hearing would be scheduled, and the entire community would hear the results. The board's downfall wasn't just beginning. It was accelerating. The days leading up to the public hearing reshaped the entire atmosphere of the neighborhood. What once felt like a quiet, orderly community now pulsed with tension, whispered speculation, and an uneasy anticipation. Neighbors who once applauded every decision the HOA made now questioned every rule, every fee, and every message the board issued. Their confidence had been shaken, not by rumor, but by evidence, evidence they knew would soon be revealed for everyone to hear. The board members attempted to maintain a sense of normalcy. They scheduled routine patrols, sent out maintenance reminders, and issued updates about community events, as though the investigation hovering over them were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But the cracks in their facade showed everywhere. Their emails were shorter. Their meetings were no longer open. Their tone carried a faint edge of desperation, as if they believed that by pretending nothing was wrong, they could make the growing storm disappear. But the storm only grew larger. The county prepared for the public hearing with precision. They requested statements, financial logs, authority records, and every relevant document the HOA had used over the past year. The board stalled on several requests, claiming delays and clerical complications, but the county was unmoved. Each delay only heightened suspicion. Each retrieved document only deepened the analysis. And each page brought the truth closer to the surface. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's curiosity intensified. People who had never attended HOA meetings were suddenly eager to know more. Conversations unfolded on sidewalks, in driveways, and at community parks. Residents analyzed timelines, compared statements, and recalled every unusual event from the past months. The once feared HOA president now found herself avoiding public places, retreating behind closed blinds and rarely stepping outside. Her confident posture, once a symbol of her authority, had dissolved into cautious glances and hurried movements. The board that once controlled the narrative now found themselves at the mercy of it. As for me, the days passed with an unfamiliar calm. The land that had sparked the entire conflict remained untouched, its quiet stillness a reminder of why I had fought so hard. The bulldozer, once positioned like a threat, had been removed within hours of the investigation's announcement. The land stood as undeniable proof of the board's overreach. But I knew the hearing wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about accountability, something the board had avoided for far too long. When the day of the hearing arrived, the community center filled faster than anyone expected. Chairs scraped across the floor as residents squeezed into every available space. Some stood along the walls, their arms folded tightly. Others leaned forward with the kind of attention reserved for moments when a community's identity is about to shift. At the front of the room sat the county officer, flanked by officials and recorders. The HOA board sat opposite them, rigid, silent, and clearly unprepared for the magnitude of what awaited them. The hearing began with a simple explanation. The county had conducted a full review of the HOA's actions, focusing on their attempt to seize land they did not control, their refusal to heed surveyor findings, and their misleading statements to both residents and officials. But the officer explained that the investigation had expanded. What started as a boundary dispute had revealed something far more systemic, a pattern of decisions made without legal foundation, documents withheld from the community, and expenditures that appeared inconsistent with reported budgets. Then the evidence began. The officer outlined the series of letters the HOA had sent to me, letters asserting jurisdiction they did not have. Each letter was displayed, each claim examined, each contradiction noted. The residents shifted uneasily as they recognized the tone they had long accepted without question. Next came the surveyor reports. The officer read from the statements, each one confirming the land lay outside HOA boundaries. Murmurs rose from the crowd, disbelief mingling with anger. The board had dismissed these reports, publicly claiming uncertainty. But the reports told a different story, a clear, definitive statement the board chose to ignore because it did not suit their plans. Then came the emails. The room fell silent as the officer recited lines from messages the board had exchanged with county offices. The wording was deliberate, strategic, and unmistakably manipulative. The board had attempted to pressure officials into redrawing boundaries through repeated requests and misleading explanations. They had spoken of urgency, community necessity, and the presumed agreement of the homeowner, none of which were grounded in truth. As the emails continued, the board members shifted in their seats. The president stared down at the table, her fingers clenched so tightly around her pen that her knuckles whitened. She knew what was coming next. Everyone did. The officer opened the final folder, the evidence I had provided. He presented the photos first, board members stepping onto my land without authorization, measuring, observing, and marking boundaries that were not theirs to mark. He presented the videos next, quiet recordings capturing their early morning inspections, their whispered discussions, and the unmistakable sound of stakes being hammered into ground they did not own. The community's reaction was immediate. Gasps, whispers, and a faint ripple of disbelief moved through the room. People looked at the board not with confusion, but with a sense of betrayal. The trust they had placed in the board had been handed back to them as a distorted shadow of authority, driven not by duty, but by personal ambition. But the most devastating moment came when the officer read the notarized letter from decades earlier, the letter in which the HOA acknowledged the corrected boundary line and affirmed that the land would remain outside HOA jurisdiction permanently. The community froze, stunned by the clarity of the document. It was a direct contradiction to everything the current board had claimed. The president's composure finally shattered. Her shoulders slumped, her gaze dropped, and her attempt to speak dissolved into silence as the officer read the concluding statement. The HOA acted knowingly and without authority. The officer then announced the county's decision. The board was being dissolved. The HOA would undergo mandatory restructuring, with temporary oversight assigned to county-appointed administrators. Financial audits would follow to determine whether funds had been misused. Penalties would be imposed, and legal consequences explored. The residents would elect a new board, one grounded in transparency and accountability. The room erupted, not with celebration, but with a relieved exhale that felt like a community finally waking from a long and exhausting dream. Some residents shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered about how long the board had operated unchecked. A few offered apologies to me, acknowledging they had believed the board's claims without question. I accepted their words with quiet gratitude, understanding the power of authority when left unchallenged. As the hearing concluded and the board members were escorted out, the weight that had hung over the neighborhood for months finally lifted. The bulldozer was gone. The threat to my land had vanished. The board's control had collapsed not through anger or confrontation, but through truth, carefully gathered, patiently held, and delivered at the moment it mattered most. Walking back to my land that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't felt since the very beginning: peace. Not just because the conflict had ended, but because the truth had prevailed. The land stood untouched, the quiet air settling around it like a promise kept. And the community, no longer ruled by fear or assumption, began its slow journey toward rebuilding trust, not just in leadership, but in one another. The HOA had thought they could bulldoze my land. They hadn't realized the evidence beneath their feet was already strong enough to bulldoze them instead.